Before we get started, I want to at least share, be a little bit vulnerable with you for a moment. Um, I'm going to be honest. I'm a little bit nervous teaching this course over the next 3 weeks. When my colleagues and I came up with the idea, it was during the summer, and we thought, given all of the contentious debates as to what anti-Semitism is, and how it's defined and how it sometimes gets used to silence people, or um, how you define it in relationship to Israel, we thought would be a very important class to at least show the history, look at the definitions, explore and examine them together, and then move back out into the world. We obviously had no idea what was going to happen. Um, and given that that is something that is in all of our minds right now, and that it's very emotionally charged for all of us who feel, at least on this side of the ocean, helpless, um, I want to just share with all of you that at the ICJS, none of us are going to adjudicate your claims in the conflict. We want you to think about all the narratives that play a role in forming people's identity, um, and that there's a legitimate, the suffering from everywhere is legitimate. How people will explain according to their narrative how that suffering happens, and a lot of people fear that they will say the wrong thing. Um, and that accounts for a lot of the silence, I think, that's out there. So in a dialogical setting, I would strongly encourage you not to listen for the wrong thing, because all of us are going to say the wrong thing. I would more encourage you to think about what you're willing to consider in a dialogical encounter. How much you want to hear the person, how much you want to engage that person, how much you want to appreciate that person's concern, fear, and suffering. Um, we're all going to say the wrong thing, because that's the nature of this conflict. And so I want to throw it out there that in our work at the ICJS, we do take those concerns very seriously. And in this course, we will talk about it in the second class, not the first. At least in my experience, it's not a good first date conversation. Um, that was a joke. Hopefully, some people were laughing. I've used it before, so maybe you're not. So with that in mind, welcome again to the ICJS. Our mission is to dismantle religious bias and bigotry, to build learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. And this course is hoping to advance that mission. We're going to have some conversation as to the trials and tribulations of defining something that is grounded in hate. So we'll get started. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint for everyone, and the PowerPoint will be available after the class. We will have a web page where there's a recording of this class, and then the PowerPoints. And also, you'll find on that web page a bibliography of books that I read in preparing for this. Okay. Now I'm sharing the screen, so hopefully you can see it. All right, good. Everyone can see it? No? All right. So here's the course outline. I like to use pieces of artwork in a lot of my PowerPoints that also tell a story. So what you're looking at comes from the beginning of the 20th century. It is an anti-Semitic cartoon, but it's also playing a role in the xenophobic policies of the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, and how that impacted Jewish immigration. So you can stare at the image as I go through the course outline. So we're going to talk about the history and politics of defining anti-Semitism today. We're going to look at the difference between anti-Judaism and how some of the people, when anti-Semitism gets coined, start to orient around the term and think about it as a term of hate. In the second class, we will talk about Israel and anti-Semitism, two definitions, two worldviews. So we're going to look at the IHRA definition that has been employed by a number of organizations, including the State Department, and the Jerusalem Declaration. These two views of anti-Semitism represent two different worldviews that we're going to explore in this course. But we're also going to consider the accusation by some that definitions of anti-Semitism are used to silence critics of Israel. And we're also going to look at accusations of how anti-Semitism informs critics of Israel. And so we'll see how both these definitions work in those contexts. And then in the third class, we're going to look at definitions of hate as political engagement, anti-Semitism in the 21st century. What's at stake when we define what is and what isn't hate? And how does that operate in a democratic environment, especially one like the United States, where free speech is a central feature of our civic discourse. So on the left, you'll see a picture of an old man with these ghouly fingers that are sucking the earth, Rothschild. The Rothschild family is used by anti-Semites, as we'll see, to talk about the Jewish impulse to take over and destroy the world. That these conspiracy theories start to fuel political engagement, start to fuel who is the arguments of who is and isn't a citizen, and it changes the way that people think about how Judaism operates in civic life. And so it's images like these that are pretty dominant in the 19th and early 20th century. So our course goals. I want us to have a better understanding of the history and politics of anti-Semitism, of defining anti-Semitism. I'm hoping that you'll walk away in 3 weeks knowing that the arguments that we're having today aren't new. That may comfort some of you, it may frustrate some of you because it means that they haven't been resolved. But there is a history to this, and it's worth considering. The second goal is that I want us to consider the contemporary political situation informing efforts to define anti-Semitism. It's not simply right-wing versus left-wing. There are a number of factors in our political situation that inform how we talk about what is and isn't anti-Semitism. And finally, my hope is to encourage people to find ways to build interreligious coalitions to combat anti-Semitism with and without a definition. As many of you know and have been following the news, the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the wake of October 7th have exploded. There are reports all over the world of Jews and Muslims being tormented, attacked. In a case in Illinois, a young Palestinian American boy was murdered by his landlord. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are real, and at a time of heightened sensitivity regarding what's going on over in the Middle East, people's worst impulses are activated. And the type of hate that plays a role under the surface in some political discourse makes its way out violently. And so part of the goal of this is that we don't want to allow that to disrupt our interreligious friendships and interreligious communities. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are wrong. And these are things that presumably everyone in the Zoom room can agree upon. And so how do we build these coalitions to fight these things together, even if we disagree as to the solutions of what's going on in other parts of the world? So tonight, I will give you an introduction as I'm doing now. And so I have two origin stories that I think are important. So anti-Semitism in a time of nationalism. So what happens in the 19th century to identity changes the way that prejudice is understood against Jews. And then I want to share an interesting figure named Wilhelm Marr, who is the person who coined the term anti-Semitism. He actually was a proud anti-Semite, and we'll see how that operated. And we'll see how that changed the way that European Christian society related to Jewish people. We will then look at late 19th and early 20th century responses to Marr. So Marr defines anti-Semitism, and we'll find that there were a lot of Jewish and non-Jewish responses to his word and his understanding of that word, and it definitely sets a trajectory and in terms of self-understanding and culture. And so I want to explore that with you for a little bit. And then there's a breakout room at 7:35, and in that breakout room, I really want you to consider all of what you've been exposed to in the previous 30 minutes, to consider what elements are actually making their way to contemporary conversations. It really is important to see how some things have changed, but some things actually have stayed the same. And then I want to move to what I'm calling the game changer, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a text that many of you know and probably have never read. It is the second most translated book in the history of the world, second only to the Bible. So it does something in how people consider their own anti-Semitism, and it makes available to people all around the world certain conspiracies about who Jewish people are, to allow anti-Semitism to form in places that don't actually have Jews. One of the interesting things is that even today, you have a world of 7 billion people, and if 16 to 20 million are Jewish, that's a fraction of a percent of the world. Most people go cradle to grave, never actually having met a Jewish person, and can still have anti-Semitic views. We're going to see how that operates. Excuse me, I'm just going to pause so I can cough and drink. For those just joining us, I shared that I have a cold, and so I apologize. And then we're going to look at how we define anti-Semitism in the wake of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I want to focus on 6 traits that come out of that book that become essential to everybody's definition of anti-Semitism, and that they're new. There were elements historically there that historians have explored, but really it puts into a text ideas that change the way that people think about anti-Semitism in really pernicious ways. And then we'll have a breakout room, and we'll talk about that. A plenary, some parting thoughts, and then we'll adjourn. Okay, how are we doing on time? Late as usual. Okay. Anti-Judaism, supersessionism, and Christian theologies. So I'm going to go through 2,000 years of theological history in 4 minutes. I should be ashamed of myself, but also it's just important for us to understand that anti-Semitism doesn't come out of a vacuum, even though I'm starting in the 19th century. So we start to see anti-Judaism in the Christian accusation of deicide against Jewish people as a whole. Right? So the accusation that Jews killed God. And by the time you get to the 4th century with Augustine, St. Augustine, you have this interesting dynamic in that Jews still exist even after the coming of Christ. And so there's this paradox that if Jews are replaced, how can they still remain? And so Augustine lays out an idea that Jews should be protected, but also they should be reminded that they are heretics. And that is interpreted in a variety of ways by subsequent thinkers and people acting in history. But it lays the groundwork for a certain type of of sacred anti-Judaism. That for some Christians, to be Christian means to be anti-Jewish, that your identity is based in the negation of the other. So moving along, we get to the blood libel emerging in the 11th century in England of William of Norwich. So the idea that your identity is based on negating another identity takes on interpersonal relationships that range from people ignoring that theology and just engaging their neighbor to religious leaders being really upset that Jews and Christians were engaging one another in a pleasant way, or sometimes in an unpleasant way. And as Magda Tater has shown in her magisterial study on the blood libel, you had bishops that were really trying to advance this argument generationally that Jews used the blood of Christian babies ritualistically for their Passover Seder. And while most people at the time didn't fully believe that, the elements of negating yourself, negating your identity, being negating of the other, created a certain, it's a fancy word, ontology, a state of being for Jews that allowed the imagination to understand that Jews were killing Christian children and using their blood ritually. Now, obviously, this had a very damaging effect on Christian-Jewish relations. On top of that, you had the Crusades, and I would encourage you to look at the ICJS video on the Crusades that was based on the course that we did on the Crusades. The violence against Jews and the violence against Muslims by Crusaders was unimaginable. And sometimes the Jews who are murdered by Crusaders are being murdered not because they live in the Holy Land, but because they're on the way, and it's doing an act of good by murdering these Jewish people. By the time you get to the 15th century in Spain now, and so I'm jumping around. So you have the Alhambra Decree, which for many people is a watershed moment in the terms of the history of racism too, because Jewish converts to Christianity are not considered Christian because they have Jewish blood. So this idea that blood is related to religion or to ethnicity, and that has some value, and that even if you convert, even if you live a different life, there's something in your natural being that will prevent you from fully actualizing in the culture that you live. It's also the time of colonial expansion, right? So colonialism starts in a really profound way in the 15th century. And so how identity is understood, especially when Europeans are going to lands where people who don't look like them, the sort of narrative that they've already built around Jews, they can apply much easier to people who look differently. And then we get to Martin Luther's on the Jews and their lies. So this diatribe that Luther writes later in his life has some famous quotes in it that people have used post-Luther, that you shouldn't just be angry when you walk by a synagogue. You should feel guilty that you're not burning it down and burning all of its books. The idea, it wasn't simply that you looked at Jews in disgust. You looked at yourself in disgust if you didn't act on this abomination of culture that still endured. So this is the background of anti-Semitism. This is what we're calling Christian supersessionism and anti-Judaism, but it really takes on a different dynamic in the 19th century. Okay. So jumping ahead to Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Philosophy students, he is required reading. For many historians, he's required reading. But he really sets into motion something that's really important to understanding anti-Semitism, even though that wasn't his intention. He writes in his lectures on the philosophy of history, the state makes history only collective groups with political sovereignty and territorial boundaries have the potential to act on the world scene as a collective group. Hegel is also notoriously opaque when he writes. Um, but he's making an argument, and he's making an argument about ethnicity and culture. So that argument goes like this. There are many people in the world. You can sail around the world and find many different people. And each people is differentiated by a culture that's different than yours. Sometimes you can translate, sometimes you can't. But that people is distinct based on its culture. And for Hegel, true cultures, cultures that are higher than other cultures, cultures that are more sophisticated, more civilized, strive for self-determination, meaning identity in their own terms, meaning that their culture should be something that is distinct onto itself, that people flourish when it's only people like them, and that they should seek that as a goal. And that the ultimate stage of culture is the formation of a state, because the state is the cultural self-expression and unity of the people making up that state. And the state for Hegel is understood culturally through three things: blood, so somehow there's a biological connection; the land, so there's a natural connection for people to the land that is different than in other places in language. So how that operates for Hegel, or not for Hegel and for many of his students, is simply, if you take a person from a different culture and put them in a Germanic one, that person cannot flourish. Even if that person learns German, even if that person contributes to German culture, because biologically they are not in their own land and they are not with their own people. What's worse for Hegel is that that person could pollute the culture. It could make the culture end up not reaching its cultural unity simply because there is um, bad blood. It can't mix. So the understanding of Judaism and Jews in this context were Jews are a people that are alien to our culture. Jews are people who are alien to our blood. Jews are people who are alien to our land. As long as Jews live in these places and are afforded rights equal to other people there, states can't actually unify and see their creative self-expression realized because of these alien elements. And so when people start talking about Jews, they start talking about Jews as an alien people. And the critique of religion, while still playing a role for many German critics and European critics, it's this idea that Jews are getting in the way of state formation. So with that in mind, enter Wilhelm Marr. Marr is a really interesting person. He's complicated and he's paradoxical. He publishes lots of anti-Semitic views before he coins the term anti-Semitism, and argues very similarly that Jews are polluting German culture, they shouldn't be there, that in fact, when German society became more liberal and tolerant and allowed more Jews freedom and rights, German society became weaker and worse off because of it. So he operates with a lot of these, at the time, now sounds like anti-Semitic cliches, and yet his three marriages were two to women who were Jewish and one to a woman who had Jewish ancestry. So he had connections to Jewish communities, and yet at the same time, he was publishing some vociferously anti-Semitic things. The one thing that made him different than other nationalists is that he believed that Jews could if they gave up every element of what it makes them to be Jewish, become German. And that meant for Marr and for many others, actually, that the sort of connection that Jews have religiously to other Jews as a people, he wanted to take away. You will be German first, and that Judaism as a religion will eventually go away, so that when they go to war with other neighboring countries, they shouldn't have a problem killing Jews in the same way that Christians don't have a problem killing other Christians in the name of the state. And so there was some charity, I guess, for Marr. He founds what's called the League of Anti-Semites in 1879, and he writes a pamphlet. And the pamphlet is the victory of Judaism over Germandom regarded from a non-confessional point of view. So in that document, Marr calls himself an anti-Semite. He says the biggest mistake, and again, now you're going to start to see some of the contradictions in Marr's thought. So he's charitable on one hand, but now he's coining the term anti-Semite, meaning that he calls Jews Semites as a way to racially other them. They don't belong in Germany. They belong somewhere else. They're Semitic. They're Semitic people. I think what's also important here is that he's not talking about Arabs or Persians or any other group in the Middle East. What he's talking about are Jews in Germany and in Europe writ large, that they're somehow racially other. And so he's anti-Semitic in that he's anti-Semites having any sort of emancipation or rights in the culture. And the pamphlet's motto is "Woe to the conquered." He's arguing that the Jews have already won, that the Germany is in decline, and that because of Jewish access now to the arts, culture, medicine, journalism, all aspects of bourgeois German cultural life, Germany became the worst version of herself. And he makes this accusation that the German liberalism is the problem because it allowed Jews to take over Germany. Because of the heart of German liberals, it undermined the whole national project. So Marr is a contradictory person. On the one hand, he's a nationalist. On the other hand, he supported many progressive causes. He's an anti-Semite, and yet he marries Semites. He believes that Jews can become German in some way, but he is opposed to Jews being German because they're Semitic. Now, the historian Moshe Zimmerman has argued, and he does it somewhat compellingly, that Marr recanted later in life and said that he was more upset by the German mystical nationalism that came about, that he really didn't hate Jews, and he regretted publishing his pamphlet and participating in the League of Anti-Semites. So that's just something to consider as Wilhelm Marr put this term into the world. So he does it in 1879, and then in 1882, the Brockhaus Encyclopedia, one of the most important encyclopedias in German-speaking provinces, includes the term anti-Semite for the first time. And in that definition, it's anyone who hates Jews or opposes Judaism in general and struggles against the character traits and intentions of the Semites. So in an encyclopedia that makes its way into libraries all over German-speaking lands, anti-Semitism is not seen as a negative. It's seen as a positive. It's someone who is against precisely these terrible characteristics influencing Germany. Theodor Fritsch, who may not be a household name now, was one of the premier anti-Semites of the 19th and early 20th century. In fact, the Nazis were very fond of his work. And in 1887, he wrote a treatise entitled Anti-Semitic Catechism, which he provided a set of commandments for anti-Semitism. Commandments, meaning to be a good anti-Semite, this is what you need to do. And his definition was pretty clear. Anti, to oppose Semitism, the essence of the Jewish race. Anti-Semitism is therefore the struggle against Semitism. In other words, it's the struggle to save humanity. If you win this struggle, you win your culture, you win self-determination, you can have the formation of creative genius in the state once we win this struggle against anti-Semitism. He's also famous for two blunders, actually. He critiqued and wrote looking back at it, I guess I could say, humorous critique of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, that Einstein was wrong, that this is the machinations of a Jewish brain. He also sent a lot of his published material to Friedrich Nietzsche, hoping that Nietzsche would find inspiration in it. And Nietzsche wrote back, I'm in the midst of writing a book now about why Germany needs to be more like Jews. So I'm confused and not interested. So Fritsch had a few of these blunders, but he was very important to the Nazis. And as you can see, he died in 1933. So he didn't actually live to see all the influence of his work. So I want to enter someone else who is a household name, who is known as the father of Zionism. But first and foremost, his work was to combat anti-Semitism. And coming out of the 19th century, out of everything that we just talked about, he was very concerned by how Jews were being treated across Europe, and he was a journalist. And as he was covering the Alfred Dreyfus affair, which some of you know, and you should Google it if you don't. Alfred Dreyfus was a French officer who was accused of spying for Germans in the 1880s, and it brought out a lot of French anti-Semitism, a lot of artwork about why Dreyfus was acting on his Jewish nature. He was not a patriot. And all of the things that we just discussed making their way into a French life. Herzl, on a train after covering the Dreyfus affair, is reading a book by a philosopher and journalist named Moshe Hess called Roman Jerusalem, where he starts to get the ideas for Zionism. And Zionism, that we'll see for Herzl, is a way to address anti-Semitism. It's a way to solve what's called the Jewish problem. He writes, "We are one people. Our enemies have made us one without our consent, as repeatedly happens in history. Distress binds us together, and thus, united, we suddenly discover our strength. Yes, we are strong enough to form a state, indeed, a moral state." So Herzl is going to take these European views of nationalism as a way to combat anti-Semitism in the formation of a new understanding of Jewish identity. That the way that the Europeans understood peoplehood, land, blood, language, was to the detriment of Jews and people unlike them. He thought that Jews, by applying these very same categories, could have a very positive view of identity, and one that would inspire change. And so he takes, as we'll see, the Zionist approach, at least an early Zionist approach, to combating anti-Semitism. And just as a preamble, a lot of people didn't agree with him. A lot of Jewish people didn't agree with him. So here are some of the early responses to Mar's definition. In 1901, the first edition of the 12-volume Jewish Encyclopedia appeared in London and New York. This is an extraordinary achievement. It was compiled in the US, and entries were written by more than 400 Jewish experts from all over the world. And when they talked about prejudice and anti-Judaism, there was an emphasis initially placed on the Christian theological origins of anti-Semitism and not on the secular political ones. They wanted to keep this as a theological issue and not a political one, especially in the US, where Jews were in a vastly different situation than Jews in Europe. And also understandings of nationalism in the US were very different than that in Europe. But the entry on anti-Semitism was very different. This is interesting. So Rabbi Dr. Gotthard Deutsch, his definition emphasized the racist rather than the religious origins and focused on the racist characterization of Jews, encompassing greed, a special aptitude for money-making, aversion to hard work, clannishness and obtrusiveness, lack of social tact, and especially of patriotism. Finally, the term is used to justify resentment for any crime or objectionable act committed by an individual Jew. So the idea, the racist idea that Jews are now accountable to all other Jews and one criminal act by one Jew represents the collective. This is a classic racist way of engaging people. And Deutsch is really moving away from the sort of theologies and some of the opaque theologies and moving into actual practice. These people are racist. They are racializing Jews, and they are racializing Jews in such a way that there's a biology that makes Jews act to a nature that is different than other people. And so we get this definition. And in England, 10 years later, Lucian Wolff, who may not be a household name for some people, but he was a proponent for minority rights. And we do have an expert on staff on Lucian Wolff, if any of you are interested. He looks at anti-Semitism, and in the 11th edition of the Jewish Encyclopedia writes, the Jews contend that anti-Semitism is a mere atavistic revival of the Jew hatred of the Middle Ages. So Wolff is interesting for two reasons. The first is that he disagrees wholeheartedly with Herzl, that Zionism isn't going to solve anti-Semitism. It's going to perpetuate more anti-Semitism, because if you consolidate the entirety of Jewish people into a state, it makes it much easier, according to nationalist understandings, to demonize them. And secondly, it challenges Jews who aren't interested in being Zionist to have their own self-identity, because they'll always be perceived as being part of that movement. So obviously, he was a contentious figure in this argument, but he was arguing that even though there is racism, like we just learned, there's still that element of theological anti-Judaism that shows up in the racism. And then finally, before we go out to our breakout rooms, I wanted to share a letter by Rosa Luxemburg, who is famous for her feminism, her critique of political economics, her critique of dogmatic Marxism, and she was a revolutionary who was raised in a Jewish household. And this letter is an interesting letter because she's discussing with her friend a novel about the Dutch Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza. And in her discussion, she writes, in regard to Jewish suffering and anti-Semitism, what do you want to do with this theme of this? What do you want to do with this theme of the special suffering of the Jews? I'm just as much concerned with the poor victims of the rubber plantations of Putumayo, the Black people in Africa with whose corpses the Europeans play catch. I have no special place in my heart for the Jewish ghetto. I feel at home in the entire world, wherever there are clouds and birds and human tears. So what Rosa Luxemburg is setting up is something that debatably exists to this day. So you have the nationalist definitions of anti-Semitism. And then what becomes interesting later is we start to see the seeds of that nationalism talking about the longest hatred, that all of Western civilization is built on an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic idea of othering Jewish people in such a way that it allowed colonization of the whole world in its most violent ways, that the anti-Judaism comes as part of Western civilization, that you can talk about democracy and liberty and freedom and pursuit of land and everything else, but it's always going to come with this anti-Jewish element that plays a role in patriarchy and sexism and violence and racism. And so we would call that the ontological anti-Semitism. But what Rosa Luxemburg is arguing is different. She's arguing that hate is the problem, and that anti-Semitism is merely an aspect of it. That if we're going to think and talk about anti-Semitism, we need to talk about hate first. And so it really does set up this understanding that there is either the longest hatred informing all aspects of political and civic life, or hate comes first, and that solving anti-Semitism is part of a much larger project of solving hate. So here's a quick summary, and then it's time for the breakout rooms. So definitions of anti-Semitism needed to consider questions of national identity, loyalty, and nationalism. So as we've seen, there are many ways in which Jews get othered, and according to nationalism, loyalty to others, and loyalty to their state. Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher, once said that Jews are only loyal to other Jews, and he meant that as something very negative, that you can't trust Jews. There's something deleterious about Jewish relationships to one another. There are questions of cultural and biological belonging. So this idea of land, language, and blood. So if Jews speak French or German, they're not even speaking their natural language. They're mimicking the language and culture of others. And that gives a sort of parasitic quality to Jewish belonging, right? That Jews can't really be like the people with whom they live. And so they're doing something to undermine it by being there. Questions of the universal versus particular hatred. So what we just described in the last slide is we have universal hatred. Right? No one has a monopoly on hate. Anti-Semitism is part of a larger problem of prejudice and bias and bigotry, versus the idea that anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism undergird all understandings of hate. Questions of colonialism and empire. So going back to Rosa Luxemburg, shouldn't we value the suffering of people all over the world? Shouldn't anti-Semitism take into account the fact that other people suffer and there's bigotry against other people? And shouldn't we have compassion across the board for all hated peoples? Identity was changing in the 19th century and early 20th century, so bigotry was changing too. Okay. I apologize that I'm not entirely on time, but we're almost there. In your breakout rooms. Oh, and I should mention that on the left, that is the art that I was describing of the Dreyfus affair. You see the many snakes in sort of as a form of an octopus that Jews have as snakes are slithering into all aspects of public and civic life. Okay. Your breakout rooms. So for 10 minutes, think about what elements of late 19th and early 20th century definitions of anti-Semitism are relevant today. You're not going to solve what anti-Semitism is, but where do you see it? How does it manifest in media? How does it manifest in your everyday life? Think about the traces and vestiges of this historical problem, and then we'll come back and we'll do some more anti-Semitism. So welcome back. Hopefully you had a productive conversation about how anti-Semitism, definitions of it in the 19th and early 20th century, show up in our conversations today. I want to move to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It, as many of you know, it's a fabricated text from the early 20th century. It details how Jewish elders are conspiring to take over the world. And it's a set of lists. If you've ever read it, it reads sort of like somebody's eavesdropping on the notes of some nefarious Jewish meeting in which Jews are detailing how they're going to take over the world. They're going to take over the world by creating contradicting economic systems like capitalism and socialism so that they can flourish in both. For instance, they can dominate capitalism because of their propensity for money, according to this document, and they can dominate socialism because socialism is grounded on the premise that everyone has equal rights regardless of religious background. So they're going to create these things so that puts civilizations in conflict with one another. I will say that when you read it, um, there is a little bit of humor involved because if it, I'm now old enough that sometimes go to synagogue board meetings. We can't agree on what to eat. We can't even agree on what to eat religiously. We can't agree on much. Way these notes are listed, there's uniform agreement among all of these elders how they're going to take over the world. And if you know anything about Jewish discourse, is that Jews fundamentally disagree with one another. So there is some humor in the forgery. I should also add a footnote that the first person to discover the forgery, especially drawing from previous sources in a patchwork, was Lucian Wolff, the person that I had mentioned earlier. Lucian Wolff was very active in fighting anti-Semitism, but he also was critical in pointing out the discrepancies in this text and why we probably shouldn't take it very seriously. Sadly, the world did. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and I would make this argument or assertion, but I doubt few would disagree with me, is the most influential work of anti-Semitism ever written. The Protocols were initially written to blame Jews and Freemasons for the 1905 revolution in Russia. And we also see that in Russian relations with the United States, as I'll talk about shortly. The work is an illustration of what we call confirmation bias. It wasn't there to convince people to hate or distrust Jews. I think this is really important. It just allowed a document to confirm what people already were believing. It was a way to take sort of this stylized anger and stylized prejudice and condense it into a text that gives it some authority, that it's no longer people saying, this is what I believe, or rumors. They now have a text to base their misinformation on. And the international sales of the pamphlet were astronomical during the 1920s and 30s, including in the US. I think some of you know that Henry Ford in the Dearborn Independent sponsored a translation of the text and published it in a series of newspaper articles in his publication. And it was a very serious thing that was put out into the US public. There was even a congressional hearing as to whether or not Jews could be trusted based on this text. Ultimately, it was considered a forgery and not worth taking seriously. But the fact that it even made that far showed the precarious situation that the Jews were in at that time. So even today, the origins of the documents are still debated, but it was first published in 1903 in a Russian newspaper, the Zamaya, the Banner. And what's interesting is that there is a Russian mystic, Sergei Nilus, who includes the protocols in his own book called The Great and Small, The Coming of the Antichrist and the Rule of Satan on Earth. So taking these anti-Jewish tropes that Jews are in line with the devil, that Jews and Satan have a relationship to one another. And he starts to see that politically in parts of Russia. In 1920, the protocols are published in Poland, England, France, and the US, and they blame the entire Russian Revolution on Jewish conspirators. Hitler, in his Mein Kampf, quotes it at length, and really at length, pages. and the Nazis published 23 editions that they teach in schools. So 23 editions, each with its own new introduction, each with its own footnote, showing how contemporary Jews are part of this problem. So you think about 23 editions in a really short period of time, you start to understand the wide influence of this particular text. So what I want to do now is that when we define anti-Semitism, regardless if you're going to take a universalist or particularist approach, I think that you need to focus on these 6 themes that come out of the protocols. And all definitions of anti-Semitism post the protocols that elders design take on these themes in some capacity. So the first is Jews and citizenship. Jews are perceived to be a state within a state. This particular phrase comes from an 18th century philosopher named Fichte, who was a student of Immanuel Kant, who was opposed to Jewish emancipation because he said that Jews were a state within a state. They had their own laws, they had their own culture. And so they were never going to be connected to German society in a way that a German would be, because they work as a state within a state. And for centuries, as Jews were pushed to the margin of society, they did have their own communities because they didn't have equal rights. And so they weren't allowed to be anything other than a self-governing entity, although with very limited communication with others. But what Fichte said, which is, I think, the most insidious, is that the only way that you could grant Jews any type of emancipation or citizenship is to chop off all Jewish heads to ensure that no Jewish idea ever endures. So Fichte, even before the 19th century, is talking about Jews having this innate proclivity to be clannish with other Jews, and so they can't be trusted. The second theme is related to Jews and money. Jews were, and obviously are still, according to anti-Semites today, perceived to have an uncanny attachment to money. So when Karl Marx and Bruno Bauer were debating on Jewish emancipation, Bruno Bauer made the argument, very similar to others, that Jews have their own laws and they would be a state unto themselves. And so how can you govern Jews when they live a different religious life from German Christians? How can Jews be a part of society when their first and foremost commitments are to other Jews? Karl Marx, in responding to Bauer, says the problem with Jewishness is not this proclivity towards other Jews, it's a proclivity towards money, right? The idea that capitalism and money is the Jewish God that he famously writes, and that we can solve the problem of Jewishness in Germany when we solve the problems of the exploitations of capitalism. Jews will no longer need, in order to survive, to become more greedy than other Germans, that the attachment to money that they have will go away. So you have this idea that Jews are always operating in a sense of money and that they're good with money. And a lot of German anti-Semites link that back to the medieval practice of money lending, in that the Jews were only allowed certain professions in Christian Europe, and one of them was money lending. And so the attachment of the Jewish sensibility for money forced onto Jews for generations becomes this idea that civilization needs to transcend. And you're starting to see how some of the art operates. But then, because of this attachment to money, and this attachment to being a state within a state and some proclivity to other Jews, Jews attained a disproportionate amount of influence in public life, ranging from media to financially supporting political movements that advance the interests of the Jewish spirit in overpowering the world. Now, the fact that there were Western and Eastern European Jews that operated in vastly different political movements that opposed one another meant for anti Semites that this was being done on purpose as a way of dividing and conquering. That the Jewish spirit is to put the world at war with one another, to weaken one another, so that in the end, world Jewry will come out victorious. It's putting the sort of machinations of Wilhelm Marr and some of the fears of German anti-Semites into a document that says this was all planned out. As you see in the picture here, we have the Jewish snake. And I think a lot of you understand the use of a snake, especially the biblical use of the snake and the connection to Jews and the devil. But through this influence in public life, and this is also very important, they start to disrupt cultural sensibilities and values that make up a good, wholesome state. They introduce ideas like atheism. They introduce ideas like individualism. They introduce ideas like communalism. They're introducing all of these ideas to disrupt good, clean minds as a way of creating generations of people who will ultimately be confused about their identity. So that when we talk about modernity, the idea that religion no longer plays a prominent role in civic and political life, this becomes part of the Jewish conspiracy to undermine civilization. And they do this through media. They do this through propaganda, as you see in the picture of the Hollywood. They do this through entertainment. They do this through science. That every single Jewish person that is operating in the modern world is advancing an understanding of modernity that is different than traditionalism as a way of confusing the youth, as a way of confusing your sense of religious life, as a way of confusing your sense of civic life. The idea that Jews propel liberalism as a way of not only elevating their own status in culture, but bringing other people to weaken the status of the culture itself. I think some of you have saw at the Tree of Life murders, the synagogue, the Tree of Life, the murders were inspired by an understanding that Jews are bringing people into the United States to undermine the value and culture of the United States, that Jews are working in tandem with illegal immigrants, with minorities, to disrupt the goodness and pureness of the country. And they do this through cinema. They do this through philosophy, through media. Modernity is working for world Jewry. And then you get to the conspiracy. This was all planned from the very beginning. That if we really look at the history of the world, wherever Jews existed, empires fell. There's no more Roman Empire because they allowed Jews to live there. That every single civilization that is in the dustbin of history was because they allowed Jews to endure. And because they conspire against the world, the hope is that as a form of survival, Jews undermine civilization so that in the end, they can control everything in the world. That even part of the Jewish religiosity is part of this idea that they're conspiring against you. And this is also, I want to throw in the biological part of the 19th century nationalism. Even if Jews don't think they're doing it, they are, because they're still acting according to their own nature. Their human nature is to conspire, even if they think they're doing something else. because their nature is evil and they only act according to that evil, no matter what they think, and no matter how well they understand culture, and no matter how well they assimilate. There's something pernicious underlying the smile. And you'll see in this picture, the Jewish snake has its body wrapped around the world. And then finally, the demonic Jew. It is part of the theological and biological nature of Jews to be evil. So this is the confluence of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism making its way into a document that people are going to use to justify their anti-Semitism. Jews are evil. And as you see in this picture, on the man on the left looks like a normal man. But behind that mask is someone sinister, someone willing to destroy your family, willing to destroy your culture for the sake of taking over the entire world. All of this stuff sounds hyperbolic, and all of it sounds even maybe a little bit unsettling. But the fact remains that people today still read this book, and it's still the second most translated book in the history of the world. So when you take these 6 traits together, to define anti-Semitism means that you're taking into consideration all these elements as a way of understanding how anti-Semitism operates in the world. And that's when you start to see subtle things. When people are critiquing someone for being anti-Semitic, what they're saying is, even if the intention was not anti-Semitic, sometimes the words that are coming out are part of these 6 features. And so there's a learning that needs to take place. And that's how the definitions of anti-Semitism are going to operate as we see moving on. Okay. So we're going to go into another breakout room. I went through that quickly so that you can have some more time to talk before our plenary. On the right, you're looking at some graffiti that was in Montgomery County here in the state of Maryland. And that was last year. So no mercy for Jews. If you go further down, you will see a swastika. But so we have these features, and these features play a prominent role in defining anti-Semitism. So in your breakout rooms, take a few minutes, take 10 minutes to see what the challenges would be in actually coming up with a definition for it. So I'll see you soon, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, looks like we are all back. On your screen, I just wanted to sum up that the goal for today was to have a better understanding of the history and politics of defining anti-Semitism. And you can see that it's difficult work. The pictures that you see on top are not old pictures. So these were disseminated in Lutherville, which is near the ICJS, in front of people's homes. It was part of a national campaign where people put these anti-Semitic lists in plastic bags, and then put rice or nuts as a way of weighing it down. And you can see every single aspect of abortion is Jewish. Every single aspect of the Biden administration is Jewish. Every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. That once you have indulged in an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, all is reasonable. The fact that you could consider abortion or COVID or the Biden administration as Jewish means that you believe that Jews are trying to undermine culture, civilization, that the things that you value, the things that are important to you, and the things that you think are good are precisely the opposite of what a Jew represents. So hopefully we get a sense of how things are operating both historically and today. You're going to get an email And in that email will be a link to the video, but also a reading list, a bibliography. At the bottom of that, there are two documents that are online. One is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and the other is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. I encourage you to read them before class next Monday. Obviously, it will be a lot more contentious because my guess is most of us can agree that definitions of anti-Semitism need to include all of these features and that there is a historical precedent for that. When talking about the state of Israel, definitions of anti-Semitism become more complicated. And so people are going to write more complicated definitions of anti-Semitism. I only ask that when you come to class next Monday, that you come with a dialogical disposition. We are fully aware of all the emotions that we are all dealing with, what's going on over there in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians. And we are aware of how we are inundated with both propaganda and anger and narratives, and that it forces us sometimes into silence. It sometimes forces us into combative postures. I'm only asking that you hold those things in abeyance on Monday so that we can try to do some serious thinking about how these definitions of anti-Semitism inform our politics, and our civic discourse. I'm also not asking you to choose one over the other. You'll find that most definitions of anti-Semitism agree on 85% of the things, but that 15% that people disagree on is combustible. And I promise that I will be well. I'm going to take better care of myself this week, and hopefully I don't have a cold. And I look forward to seeing all of you next Monday. Thank you.